back to the Brand and Joe podcast. Our guest today is Mark Arian. He received his BA in economics from Duke University and went to law school at Columbia. He has previous experience at Aon, WTW, EY, and is currently the CEO of consulting at Kornferry. Welcome, Mark. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks, Brandon.
Yes, we've talked a lot about consulting on this podcast before, but to speak to someone that leads it at such a prestigious firm like Korn Ferry, I bet the experience that you have to tell us, just especially what you've told us before we even started the recording, we're not excited, but I mean, we're not just excited, but also our listeners are going to be very excited too to hear what you get to tell us all about. Uh, and actually, we were doing some research before you started on. You had a CNBC article right before we started about imposter syndrome. And I bet this is something that gets floated around a lot during your meetings and during your plannings. Uh, is this something that is talked a lot about with like your clients or your employees and like maybe your organization in general?
Yeah, it sure is, and actually, it goes fairly deep in organizations. But the CEO, surprisingly, has the highest percentage of this what we call imposter syndrome, and really what it is a discomfort of sorts with their capabilities against what they're being pressed to address. And I think a lot of it stems from something that might be topical to everybody on this podcast. CEOs are classically trained. They typically come up through a finance organization. They take on P&L responsibility, larger P&L responsibility. And what the CEOs in this survey told us was they're very comfortable with their training. They feel equipped to run a profit and loss, a P&L, a business, and there are no misgivings about their training per se. But you recall that this is a really strange time. You've got people, CEOs, who are dealing with not only running a P&L, but you've got a political fracturing in really every part of the world. So Congress, the president, Supreme Court, the UK government, the French government, nobody, the approval levels are at an all-time low. And employees and communities are looking to CEOs to pick up that standard and be the standard bearer of everything good, of culture, to opine on whether Russia or the Ukraine, what's their position on this, or what's happening in the Middle East. And it's not something they're trained for, and they're being stretched to really do what we call horizontal leadership. So P&L leadership is vertical leadership, but to be able to address culture, to address a global workforce, how about hybrid work environment, which is new, excess real estate, inflationary pressures on labor, and at the same time top line growth that's being forestalled, despite what people say. There's probably a white collar recession going on. So there's a lot that they have to handle that they're not equipped to, and most of that is horizontal, and that is not what they've been trained for.
It's interesting when you talk about that too. A thought that comes to my mind is not just what they have to handle, but in the speed of how they handle it. Is that something that you've looked into as well, Mark, with in terms of this research of like how quickly people are reacting to these things in the C-suite?
Sure, and look, I had a CEO tell me just yesterday that it used to be that they had one thing they had to deal with, and it had to be resolved, and they had some time to do that and people to lean on. But now they're getting hit with three or four things, and they're stretching them beyond what their capacity is to do that, especially as they've leaned out their organization, in the past several years in preparation for a downturn, which is probably, forthcoming.
I know part of the article also discusses like after like a short amount of time, sometimes you might see a CEO resign, maybe like a year or two in. How is that transition like when you're coming into like a consulting company in terms of like that's a whole new leader? I mean, it's the leader that's changing. Are there certain like key themes that you look for to help progress that in like a natural way?
So, Joe, I think you're asking a question that's kind of like a Damascus sword, double-edged. One is that we deal with CEOs that resign at clients all the time. Succession planning and succession work is like bread and butter work for us. We do a lot of work around succession, building a succession tree, working with the boards. CEOs have always had a very short lifespan, 3 to 5 years, and that's one of the reasons our search business, the dominant search business in the world, is so active at the CEO level, because it's a high pressure job, and a lot of people do it for a certain number of years and then they move on. And it's also true that consulting firms, which I think is the other part of your question, consulting firms themselves, coming in as a CEO is challenging. Every consultant thinks they know everything about business and has it's like herding cats. They have opinions. So coming in from the outside as a CEO in any enterprise is a little bit like the Mars lander. You can prep and NASA can do all the field work, but you're still landing on a cold planet, thousands of miles away that you're unfamiliar with. So um, coming into a consulting firm is particularly challenging, I would say. It certainly was for me. But I knew what I was getting into, having worked in consulting firms. It's a different environment because you have so many quote unquote experts, who have points of view.
Yeah, no, it's great to hear that too. And as somebody who is a CEO, Joe alluded to that in the beginning, talking about your experience. It's really cool to kind of talk about not just the experience of somebody as a CEO, but also have the other side of it as a consultant because you have that in your background as well. One thing that we want to kind of start off and kick off the episode with is talk to you about that idea of pursuing like an executive level role. So, kind of what led you to pursuing that?
I'll tell you a funny story that's not so funny, maybe. But when I was a young consultant, I had a wonderful manager, and he gave me a lot of sage advice. He did a great job mentoring me. Among other things, he told me, these are kind of life lessons. He said, make sure you fill in your dartboard. Become an expert at something, and then don't just stay there. Treat it like a dartboard. Look for something adjacent, something else to learn and grow. Be able to grow horizontally. I've used that word a couple times now, not just repetitively doing the same thing. You can be deep and narrow and do the same thing over and over again, or you can broaden and stretch yourself and push yourself, achieve some stretch goals. But he also told me, I mean, I have a sense of humor. My children tease me about it because in my current role, I really can't do what I would like to do: play practical jokes, joke with people. It's much harder to do at my level. But early in my career, I'd put a sign up on the men's bathroom. Somebody was not flushing, and I put a humorous sign up. And my manager said, pulled me in and said, that was very funny, but what do you want to be known for? I don't think you want to be known for being the practical joker of the office. So be purposeful about what you're known for. And I thought it was just great advice. I mean, I did take it to heart. I didn't lose my sense of humor, at least until I became a CEO. But I think it's really important to aspire, have a sense of where you want to go, what you want to do. For me, it was about making an impact. I've always wanted to make a bigger impact. And that started as a consultant early in my career. I was ambitious about what projects I took on, what I was willing to do to learn and grow in the job. And it's still true. I aspire to be the best consulting firm in the world, and to make sure that I'm delivering outcomes to my clients that nobody else can deliver. And you know that's how I'm wired. And I would encourage people to think about what they want and to be uh, positively aggressive about growing their skills towards that end.
Yeah, I like what you said about being purposeful, giving yourself like a goal to reach for instead of just walking aimlessly, because it can lead you in a direction and having like trying to gain those skills to move yourself, as you said, vertically and horizontally, instead of just doing your job day to day. Maybe you're learning something, maybe you're not. Um, you don't really find your way to go forward. And I also want to touch upon your manager piece. I mean, I bet you talk to this about your clients and your own firm as well, but having like that team to fall back on and learn from. I know I have it where I work. I know we've had it, Brandon, I've had it at schools with our professors. It makes all the difference. Like, I mean,
Sure.
that's what like our IO is all about.
I think teaming is incredibly important. I think growing as a team is incredibly important. Our teams, I do something called a spotlight call. I do it once a month. I spotlight projects that I think have delivered extraordinary value to clients, and I ask particularly our juniors and mids what they learned on the project. What was meaningful about it? Why? What were the challenges they faced? What could we be doing better as a firm? And more often than not, what they talk about is their team and leaning on each other and helping each other and growing by watching each other. And and actually pulling each other up. Um, so the teaming aspect is challenging right now, especially with hybrid. People used to be able to walk into people's offices, and it's more challenging now. For guys like you and people who are graduating now, it's a little bit more challenging. I used to have the delightful pleasure of being able to walk down a hallway and pull people into a room or be pulled into a room. So the teaming aspects are really important. They really are.
Yeah, the teaming aspects, and I think that you also kind of picked up on the part of the learning aspect too, because a lot of the collaborative work that's usually done in person is not normally done like that anymore. Some places being fully remote, some places being hybrid. Have you seen that shift how you lead with that shift into hybrid or remote work?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's been a challenge for us, and it is for most CEOs because you have preconceived notions, and I did too, that being in the office was important. But it turns out that for my clients, it's not important. They want teams on the ground when they need them on the ground. They're saving money by not having people, fly out for every meeting, which they like. And I don't want to economize everything, but our margin actually goes up when people are working from home. That's an hour or two in some cases, especially in the New York area, where they don't have to commute. And some of that time is spent working on clients, and some of it is spent pursuing other interests or going for a walk and creating a better work life, if there's such a word, work life balance. But I do think that there are important opportunities to bring people together to learn. We just did a session down in Dallas with some of our high potentials, and we had a who's who of our leaders presenting and talking and doing case study work. And the topic was, how do you actually work with a C-suite or a board? These are people who are very good and accomplished, but haven't yet worked with a CEO or a CFO or a board, and it's a different experience. So we put them through, the drill. We had a case study. We did a case study driven model, and by far and away, people said it was the most valuable thing they've done this year. You know, they would have traded a lot for it. And it turns out that we do something called rewards optimization studies in our rewards group. And those really look at the cost of delivering certain, I'll call them benefits to employees against what people actually value, how they value them. They use something called conjoint, which you may be exposed to or not. It's a longstanding marketing technique, but it's trade-off analysis. And one of the things about your generation that's really interesting is that they will trade off hard dollar things that cost a lot of money, pension, 401k match. I've got a client that gives a dollar for dollar match on the first 5% of pay. That's costing them 5% of payroll, obviously. And it's worth about 2% from a value standpoint for people in your generation. But this is an engineering firm, so PMP training, project management training, but certification, black belt certification through a major university's business school is worth 8 times the cost of the program. The cost of the program is less than 1%. If all but 30,000 employees took it, it's worth 8% to people because they want to learn, they want to grow, they want to accrete skills, and grow their capability. And look, honestly, many folks in your generation aren't going to be 30-year IBMers, so they can monetize it when they leave or if they leave. Into the and go back to the work world. But it's really an interesting analog to your question.
I like that part about the benefits. It's not I don't
Yeah.
think we talked a lot about it in our classes, but we had the pleasure of going to some what you call them, Brandon, like meetings. There's stuff called Disrupt HR, and we went to
Yeah,
one where they
people
talked
tank too.
about people tank. Sorry, yes, that's
Yeah.
what it is. And they talked about the benefits of benefits and not just the base salary, but like what else companies can offer, whether it's like mental
Right.
health, whether it's the 401k matches. Um, do you mind explaining just a bit more about that, the 2% versus like the 8% of like how they measure
Sure. Yeah.
what what is actually beneficial for the employees or what they like?
Yeah. At a simplistic level, if you gave people 100 cents and a dollar and asked them to put those cents, bet on where and you can do this through iterative problems, so you don't game the system. What they value, and then change the mix again and see what they value, and then change the mix again. you can end up with a composite that's pretty reliable. And you can striate it based on different, you know, Gen Z, baby boomers. You could do it by high potentials. You could do it by segments of the business, IO versus others. And and it's a trade-off analysis. What do you really care about? Health insurance? Do you care about 401k match? Do you care about vacation time, flex time? Do you care about hybrid work? Do you want to work from home? You can evaluate those, but in a fixed with a fixed number, so that the people really are forced to make trade-offs, and then change the logarithm and have them do it again and again. And you come out with some pretty predictive metrics. And we call it an efficient frontier because a client, obviously, right now in this economy, companies are not looking to spend more money, but they want to make sure that they engage their employees. Engagement is not a satisfaction measure. It's, am I motivated? Do I feel aligned? Do I feel like this is a place I want to commit 150% to? So it's a little different than, am I satisfied? You might not be satisfied with your pay or with your, but but um, but do you understand where the organization is going? Are you aligned with the purpose of the organization? Do you feel committed? Is your commitment at a high level? And when you measure engagement, there's something called an efficient frontier. You can actually see where you can do trade-offs. So you normalize your costs or keep them constant, but you're driving engagement up. And so, in my example with my engineering client, this training, that people were hungry for certification and training. They overvalued it relative to other things.
It's really cool to hear this perspective. Sometimes Joe and I will talk about it on this podcast, where there's the IO knowledge that we gain in our programs, but sometimes the business savvy knowledge that you might not be able to get from the program, but you can pick up from experience. So, like what you're talking to, Mark, is a lot of, I guess, areas that we touch on, like engagement, for example, where IOs will work to build maybe an engagement survey and try and gauge what it's looking like within the corporation, but might not necessarily see what it looks like from a number standpoint as much. So are you kind of saying here that that is what you're showing, is there's like a numbers game, two levels of engagement or things of that nature?
Yeah, but you also raised an interesting sub question. Maybe you didn't intend to, but I'll answer the question I think you kind of are dancing around, which is, there's book learning and then there's street learning, client learning. And I use that example of filling in your dartboard, but there's also something. When I joined this firm 7 years ago as the CEO, we had a lot of really talented people, and I used to make fun of. I love my IOs, just so you understand. But you could walk around the offices around the world, and you'd see, Psychology Today, or you didn't see the Wall Street Journal on their desks. And I think one important thing I would share with you is that you can be very deep and narrow in a field, and it's important. I call them eyes for many reasons. They're deep and narrow, but they also define themselves. I do work measurement. I do surveys. I really look to hire T's, people who have that depth. You can be a very good IO and have very good skills, but you also have to be able to synthesize. That's my word. Problem solve. I like to reverse engineer. I start with outcomes. What will make the client happy? What are they trying to get to? What is a business outcome that makes sense? What is an employee outcome that makes sense? And then reverse engineer that. What kind of IP and data do I need to bring to the table? What kind of human capabilities? How do I get there and roadmap it? We have 100 million executive assessments on file, more than 100 million. They're highly predictive. Our IOs and our data scientists have really kind of cracked the code on, predictive logarithms. If somebody looks like this profile, what does that mean for their likelihood of future success? It empowers our acquisition talent, the search people. It helps our org design capabilities going backwards. But you got to be able to think in terms of outcomes, and that requires synthesis, problem solving. So that's what I look for. Those kind of people who want to be T's. You're not going to be a T coming out of school, no matter how good your professors are. But knowing where you want to get to, and being aware of where your gaps are, that dartboard, plus that inner drive to grow and learn and accrete practical knowledge is really important. Brandon, did I answer your question? Because Yeah, I
Yeah,
may not
definitely.
have.
No, no, you did. I think it's interesting to hear the perspective that you brought in too of like the synthesis of knowledge and understanding where people are gaining their knowledge from. And I think that it's good to note that you can specialize in a lot of different areas and still be able to come in and learn practical business knowledge from different areas and perspectives. So I thought you answered the question and added a lot more value to it. So it was good.
I want to. It's actually a good segue into because we kind of jumped right into your current position. But the cool thing about our podcast is we draw upon people's background and education and how they came to where they were. And part of the Brandon's question was drawing upon different areas, and one of those being your professors and your previous education. I know we stated in the beginning that you went to law school at Columbia. How do you still draw upon like themes learned in school, or were you like planning to go into law and then found your way into consulting? Can you like dive into that
Sure.
for a bit?
Yeah, I did go to Columbia. I wanted to go into transactional work, M&A work. Um, I had won the what's called the moot court competition at Columbia, and everyone thought I should be a litigator, which you really have to like to fight to be a litigator, to be a good one. I didn't want to be a litigator, and I grew up in the Midwest, so I thought I outsmarted everybody. I went to work for a really large, major Midwestern firm in New York, where my wife was working, and I said, "Wow, nice firm, Midwest values." They told me I wouldn't have to do litigation. This is the best of both worlds. So I'm in New York, but I got a Midwestern firm with Midwestern values, and they told me I don't have to do litigation. Within 2 weeks of getting there, I was put into litigation, and the partners there were very clear. Like, we grew up in New York firms. We agreed to be part of this Midwestern firm to open their New York office. So we're New Yorkers, and we don't care what they told you. It wasn't very satisfying. It was a pretty awful project I was working on. I don't want to identify it, but it was just not a good situation. So I left. I wanted to do transactional work. I went to work for a consulting firm in the human capital space, and I did transactional work. I got involved in transactional project work, and lo and behold, I was brought onto a project with General Electric early. I'm old, so date myself a little, but early in their Six Sigma journey, and they were building out some M&A tools, and I got put on that project, and I seized the opportunity, carpe diem, and I think every one of your folks should do the same thing. This was an opportunity. I threw myself into it, helped build some of those tools. Some of those tools are still in use, by the way. It ended up cementing a relationship with GE in the M&A space. I did hundreds of transactions with them in the human capital arena, GE Capital, GE, and then started to innovate. And I think innovation is a lifeblood of a consulting firm. I noticed something, and your fellow students might have noticed things like this too, or if their eyes and ears are open. I noticed that some of the best M&A people were missing huge amounts of liabilities or problem sets. And the reason was they went back to the trough and what they knew. Remember that eye example again. They went back to things that had bit them in the bottom the last three projects. And I developed a playbook to try to get to an 80-20 rule. If I could get 80% of the problems or liabilities in due diligence or potential integration issues, that would be a pretty good start. And I built a full integration room and a due diligence room, and I started to run my clients through it. I'd run the A team through their own model. Let the best people go at this and do it their way. And I planted like $400 million of liabilities, all kinds of landmines in integration to see who would pick this up. Complicated potential merger. I built a case study, and I'd run the B team. Joe and Brandon, I don't mean you're B players, but you're young, so you guys would have my playbook, and you would go through the same process. The A teams picked up about 30% of the liabilities and 30% of the potential integration issues. Remember, I also had an interview of fake executives that I built in. The B team picked up close to 80%, which is what I had predicted because it was a roadmap to look at the issues that were likely to be the most pressing in a traditional merger. That allowed me to just pick up clients right and left, because at the end of the day, it was teaching them two lessons. One is that they could do better with the right training, but they're still leaving 20% on the table. And I planted a lot, think about $300 or $400 million, and 20% of that, more than pays for the consulting, the consultant of choice. So, I built a business around that. I built a couple successful businesses, and then I broadened it to transformation and change management and org effectiveness, levels, layers, spans, and then talent. And that was my M&O for many years. So the legal training was actually really helpful. I became more than that, and I was no longer the legal specialist over time, but it informed a lot of what I did, and also how I approached it. Lawyers have to write letters, black and white. Is this clients will press them? Can I do this? Can I not do this? A consultant who's a lawyer can actually push the lawyers in the gray zone because there almost always is gray, and the lawyers would otherwise say black or white. So I advocated for my clients and pushed the lawyers to a good business outcome for my clients. So that too became very valuable to me. I still find it valuable. I'm flying out to Dallas in a few weeks. One of our private equity clients is thinking of taking an organization public, and that happened to be an area that I had expertise in. So it's still helpful. It's not what I do day in and day out, but learning can be applied in lots of different ways.
Looks like Joe, you and I are getting our law degrees next. I think that it draws on. I know, Joe, you remember our professor, Dr. Nolan. I remember sitting in his class the first day of our program, and he said, getting your master's in IO psychology, it changes the lens in how you view the world. And I feel like that's kind of what you're alluding to there too, Mark, where it's like getting that law degree, it changes the lens of how you view things. So you can speak as a consultant, but you're still seeing things as a lawyer. And also being able to kind of switch that now with your experience, you've been able to switch your lens to different viewpoints, which is really, really intriguing. And with your experience, Mark, I feel like that's really cool to hear just stories of how you've been able to do that in the past. And now I don't want to keep you too long. I know Joe and I want to make sure we are conscious of time here. We want to make sure we ask you the question we ask all of our guests on this podcast, just like a piece of advice that you have for prospective early career students or people who are just early on in their careers in general. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, look, I went to really great schools and pushed myself, and increasingly as I get older, I see it's not really where you went to school, and most people are smart enough. Um, it really has a lot to do with resilience. Everybody's going to fail. Failure is part of learning. You're going to be challenged. Being able to be resilient and also being willing to learn from every situation, being hungry to learn. We find that as in our CEO profile. A hunger to learn is really important. The ability to team with people is important. The ability to make a team better is important. But honestly, resilience is an underlooked skill that I really do look for. Are people going to hold their tents when things get challenging or hard, or a client barks at them? I've been fired from clients. It's very easy to kind of roll away with your tail between your legs. It's also really important that you learn from everybody and everything, and try to continue to grow your dartboard, as it were. So that would be my aha moment for you guys.
So it's an amazing piece of advice. I think a lot of people know that feeling of not succeeding and
Yeah.
failure. It's a common feeling through everybody. But as we said before, having that team around you that can support you during failures, and knowing yourself that it's not the end of the world and things happen, and learning from those mistakes and failures to set yourself up for success in the future. Um, Great piece.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you something I innovated this year a little bit. We do client net promoter scores. The client's satisfied with the work we do, and throughout my career, people usually it's like a friends and family exercise. They'll ask the people that love them to provide feedback because they're worried about getting a bad a bad score. I want to hear from clients what didn't go well. I want to hear from the clients that don't like us and don't. I learn more from what we haven't done well, and I don't penalize people for it. I want to learn. I want to make sure that at the end of the day, we're taking the information and getting better, and that's really what it's about. Self improvement at a firm level and at an individual level.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that it's really intriguing too, because it's kind of full circle with how we opened today, talking about imposter syndrome and CEOs feeling imposter syndrome and early career people feeling imposter syndrome. In order to have imposter syndrome, you will sometimes fail, and you have to make sure that you're resilient through that and don't let the imposter syndrome take over, especially when you're early on in your careers, because you need to learn from those moments and grow. So I feel like that all kind of goes hand in hand with what you were talking to and alluding to there too, Mark. So I think that was a great piece of advice. I don't think we've had the resilience piece on here, Joe. I can't remember.
It's a necessary skill to have / learn. I
Oh
like
yeah,
it. Thank you, Mark, for joining us for this half hour. It was
You
a
gentlemen
pleasure
are
getting to
both
talk to
very
you.
welcome. Yep.
Yeah, you have some amazing experience. I'm excited for our listeners to hear this episode, especially from your I don't want to say unconventional background, but a background that we haven't heard on this podcast yet. So it'll be interesting to hear what people think.
Well, great. I enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
take care, Mark. Thank you. That was a fun episode, Joe, talking to Mark about his experience. I think it's really cool to talk to someone who's a C-suite executive, specifically in the consulting area. I feel like we haven't really gotten to dive deep into that before.
Yeah, I mean, like everyone's heard of Kornferry, whether no matter what part of the business you are a part of, it's a name out there. So to talk to someone like you said, that senior who has a lot of control over the direction of the organization, just interesting to hear about his journey and his pathway to like where he came to be.
Yeah, and you speak on the pathway. I think it's really cool to see somebody who has like an unconventional background, who is leading teams of IOs, like somebody who works with people like you and I who have a lot of experience in working with those types of individuals. I think that's really cool too, to see that you don't need to have an IO degree to do work that IOs are doing.
No, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if we've talked to someone who is in law or like with previous experience um, working in like big corporate law.
Yeah.
So let us know what you guys think. It was a pleasure getting to talk to Mark. So we hope you guys enjoyed his different idea set, different than the usual IOs that we get to discuss with. But thank you guys for listening, and we will see you guys. What, 2 weeks? Yeah, Brandon.
2 weeks now. Yep.
2 weeks. Thanks, guys.